So everyone kind of looked away for a little while, and comics kept moving along and growing. But that damage was done, and so that's why, in France and Japan, who didn't have that happen to them, no one was ever, necessarily going to try and pull comics off shelves because they said that they were causing kids to commit suicide, which was put out here. Since that never happened there, comics as a medium is much more accepted universally.
Well, I mean, like, in France had Tintin and we had, Superman and Batman, so, it's much more of like an escapist adolescent thing, and was, and I mean, that's the perception, that's the surface perception that carries on to today, and even though there's a much broader, depth of subjects and
there's a richness that is seen. I mean, I'm not like Kyle, where
what?
Kyle lives in.
I hear
what? But it seems to be richer. It seems to have more depth now. It seems to be almost novel-like in some ways. Yeah. Not just the beach fluff or the Archies or the Superman superheroes.
A big middle opened up. For the longest time, there was there was superhero comics and then like art and then like crump. And then it was kind of like the guys in the 80s, like Frank Miller and Neil Gaiman with Sandman. Like those guys kind of opened up this weird middle ground that is kind of like one of their grandchildren, like where like 20 years ago it would have been much harder for me to get a career in comics, and I would have been drawing differently. I would have been trying to draw like Steve Ditko or Jack Kirby, and I would have had to live in New York, and I would have to start out in the bullpen, and whatever. So like, it's only because that middle opened up that I really, am getting to do what I do in the form that it exists now. And yeah, I mean, it's great that middle is out there, and that middle is like Dark Horse, IDW, Vertigo, and really, it's almost expanding to the point where it's gonna, eclipse everything, I think. I mean, there will always be top shelf and Oni, like, independent comics that are kind of more about people and their kind of everyday existence.
Well, I'm also seeing a lot of, like you've got Chuck. Mm-hmm. We're seeing a lot of media properties now that there seems to be something for everything. So whether it's Chuck and it's a comic book, or it's T-shirts and merchandising, there's video podcasts or podcast aspects of this, there's blogs, there's games, there's all sorts of things that follow into this, and it opens up the opportunity that if
it's the G4 pop culture overlap,
Yeah.
Well, the thing that you're hoping for eventually is to have, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but you kind of need to stop having comic book fans and just have people who read comics. And what I mean by that is there's a percentage of comic book readers who just read everything, and eventually you're going to have people who, they only read this kind of stuff, or they only read, well, that's most comic book readers. Like most people who buy comics, they've read almost a little bit of everything, and eventually you're going to get to where it is in like movies. Like, I don't go and see every movie ever made. I go see the movies that I like. And there are other people who may want to see, this movie, and people may see this movie. They're not watching all of them. There was a time in Hollywood where it was, gangster movies, westerns, and musicals. But the genres branched out to where now there's a little bit of something for everyone.
Right.
And eventually you're going to get to that point in comics where I'm not going to read everything that's out there because there's too much out there. Instead, I'm just reading the stuff.
It's already like that.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it needs to get. It's going to progress further to where we're reaching, people, the 40-year-old woman, soccer moms.
But it's also the way it's marketed and promoted to people as well. You go into a Barnes and Noble and you look at it, and everything is squished together in comic books and graphic novels into one shelf or whatever. Outside of that, you look at the rest of the books. They've got the fantasy sci-fi section. They got the mysteries. They got the biographies. Everything's nicely laid out. Everything's labeled. You got room to breathe. You can browse and enjoy looking at the cover of a book. Whereas you get into the comics and the graphic novels, everything's squished together. So then you got to, you pull one out, and then there's so much detail that you're looking at. It's a whole different experience, and they're not selling it as another experience. What they're doing is they're just saying this is over by the humor section, and so they rely on the serious fan to go out and weed through that stuff rather than pulling it out and making it more accessible to
And it is
the
good
average.
because, for instance, Bone, which is a children's book, it's no longer in the graphic novel section. Bone is in the children's section of Barnes & Noble. Or Fun Home by Alison Bechdel is not in the graphic novel section,
So
it's in the
yeah.
memoirs. And you may get a little bit more of that.
That's gonna get confusing.
It will.
It's gonna get weird.
Yeah, because I couldn't find a certain book and it ended up being.
Well, though that's kind of the thing right now, is because you have that graphic novel section, and in most bookstores and even most comic book stores, they can't decide how to organize it because there's usually
Everything's thrown together,
well, the
unless
thing
it's
is
by
that
alphabet.
For every book, it's like 2 to 5 creators. So okay, whose name do you put it under? Because they're all equal. They're all equally
True.
important. Then you have the title of the book, and then you have the genre. Well, how do you organize it? Because no one can really decide. If you look at the standard, a lot of standard comic shops, you'll have a section that says A, and then you'll have a section that says Frank Miller, and it's hard to.
Amazon.com.
Yeah, Amazon helps. But
I want to thank everybody. We've kept this long. Thank you very much.
It's helpful for kind of Flash to actually.
Y'all should have been at South.
They're talking about doing comics like actually going into the page.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Different types of sessions, like the hands-on, actually showing that kind of stuff as well as.
Cool.
Well,
Yeah, they had this whole panel about online comics at South.